Okay, good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. Thank you so much for joining us. I see our assistant rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Kurtz is here too. Wonderful to see you. And I want to welcome everybody to what we've gotten used to. Hopefully we'll have, continue learning virtually, but hopefully we'll have more in-person opportunities in the future. I feel that the speaker today needs no introduction, but I have to give an introduction anyway, because David's now part of our community. I'll give the formal one first for those that may not know. David is the Dean of Pardes. He holds a BA and MA in History and PhD in Religious Education from New York University. He also attended Yeshivat HaMivtar. He's been the Dean of Pardes since 1998. He also was the director of Midrash Lindenbaum, known as Bravenders, for 12 years. He was a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel School for Jewish Education in Jerusalem from 1996 to 1998. Before making Aliyah in 1984, David was the director of informal education, which we were just reflecting on a little bit, at the Ramaz Upper School in New York City, where it created and taught a 2-year curriculum integrating world and Jewish history. In our community, and I personally have gotten to know David very well over the past few years and are eternally grateful for leading our trip to Poland, not only to understand the Shoah, but Polish Jewish history. It transformed my view of Jewish history and life, and I know Diane's and so many others that joined us. And I always feel like I need to give a shout out to Stephen Cohen, who was the one who said, "You've got to take this trip." He would go with Rabbi Lookstein and David. And David, we really appreciate your taking the time to share your insights. I just started to read a book that you recommended a couple of years ago, which is not an easy book to read, by Christopher Browning, called Ordinary Men. I still remember you talked to us about that book. And God willing, we'll continue to learn together virtually, in person, hopefully take some trips together in the future. Shem should bless you and your family with only good things, and God willing, we'll share good news in the days ahead for Klal Yisrael and the world. So without further ado, I'd like to ask David to begin his presentation today.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Cohen, for that exaggerated introduction. And good to meet you, Rabbi Kurtz. It's good to see some familiar names. I'm not seeing too many faces, but good to see some familiar names and some new names as well. The topic that we're going to be talking about today is actually a very difficult topic, an emotional topic. One that I think you can find emotions on all sides of this discussion. And that is the complexity of Polish-Jewish relations. I'm going to start at more or less the beginning. Polish-Jewish relations, we could say, starts with King Boleslav the Pious in the 1200s, who invites the Jews to Poland. And that is followed by King Casimir the Great, who in the 1300s invites the Jews again. And each time, each of these kings grants the Jews what they called in the Middle Ages privileges. We would call them rights today. and really, the Jews lived under the protection of the monarchy in Poland. And they were more welcome in Poland during the Middle Ages than they were in German areas, French areas, Spain, all of those places where they were expelled from. England, Portugal. The Jews were never expelled from Poland. And the Jewish community began to grow very, very much. But I want to take a step back and look not at history, but at national psyche and national culture. And what I'm showing you now, Rabbi Cohen, I assume everybody can see the screen, the map?
They should be able to, I hope. Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Good, okay. So what you see in black are the borders of Poland today. That's the border, those are the borders of Poland in 2020 or 21. And then you can see 1620. That enormous glob is the Polish kingdom. It was the largest country in Europe. Poland was immensely powerful in the 1500s and early 1600s. It actually was part of the reason why there was a golden age for the Jews in Poland in the 1500s and early 1600s. And that's one part of what we might talk about. But what I want to focus on is, who are Poland's neighbors? Well, you've got Sweden to the north. They're Protestants. You've got Russia to the north and east. They're Russian Orthodox. You've got Germans who are predominantly Protestant. You've got Ukrainians who are Ukrainian Orthodox. Poland is invaded by all of these forces in the 1600s and 1700s. And it's one of the reasons why Polish nationalism is tied to Roman Catholicism. Poland has no natural borders. There are no oceans. There are no enormous rivers to cross. There are no big mountain ranges. And no deserts. And so Poland is invaded time and again. And it's invaded time and again in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s and beyond by nations that are not only different nationally, but different religiously. And what I'm trying to say is Polish nationalism and Roman Catholicism are intertwined very, very deeply. The best analogy to this is Spain, the Spain of Ferdinand and Isabella, which in the late 1400s united Castile and Aragon, and later some other states in the Iberian Peninsula who actually had different dialects and didn't have so much in common. They were brought together under the banner of Roman Catholicism. Similarly in Poland, nationalism and Catholicism go together. Now I want to show you another map. This is a map, 1795. And hopefully you can see the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Where's Poland? Poland has disappeared. The Polish people haven't disappeared. The Polish language hasn't disappeared. But by 1795, Prussia, later Germany, Russia and Austria have carved Poland up. They've partitioned Poland 3 times so that in 1795, there is no longer a Poland recognizable on the map. There is no independent state of Poland. And this adds one more element to the psyche. Not only is nationalism tied to Catholicism, but Poland views itself as a victim nation. A nation that was partitioned, that lost its independence. They view themselves as victims. And just to bring it up to date even more, when the Soviets conquer Poland in World War II and defeat the Germans as they move towards Berlin, communism becomes implanted in Poland, clearly under the aegis of the Russians, and that to most Poles is terribly insulting, and they feel dominated once again by a foreign power. And the main opposition to communism in Poland during the 50 years of communism, from 1945 or 1948, if you like, till 1989, 50 years of communist rule, the main opposition is the Catholic Church. So once again, the church and Polish national feelings are closely tied together. So with this as background, the cultural psyche, and by the way, Poland is partitioned again in 1939. When Germany invades Poland to begin World War II, Russia invades from the east, they divide up Poland. It's like a reincarnation of the original partition that you see on this map. So again, Poles view themselves as victims. So with this as background, let's go back to the early 20th century. Poland is indeed recreated as a nation state after World War I. And like most of the new states created after World War I, remember the Treaty of Versailles, President Woodrow Wilson, self-determination for all nations, the 14 points. Many new nations are created. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, for example. Hungary becomes an independent state as the Austro-Hungarian Empire breaks up. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. Poland also, many of those states experience a tremendous surge of national feeling. And that surge of national feeling is something that the Jews in the interwar years are going to be very wary of, the Jews living in Poland. There's also a war with Bolshevik Russia right after World War I that only increases those feelings, and elements of the Polish army launched pogroms against the Jews in that war against the Bolsheviks. They view the Jews as Judea Komuna in Polish. They view the Jews as communists or allied to the communists. And in the interwar years, there are boycotts of Jewish shops. There are expressions by leading statesmen like the foreign minister of Poland and the cardinal of Poland, Cardinal Chlon, advocating boycotts of Jewish shops, advocating that the Jews should move to Madagascar. In fact, if you speak to survivors from Poland, if you're fortunate to have one around nowadays, they'll tell you that the epithet was Jews go to Palestine in Poland at the time. All of this is, of course, the prelude to World War II, the Nazi occupation of Poland. And of course, this is a particularly contentious point in Polish-Jewish relations. And I want to start by looking at the Ulma family. The Ulma family who live in Markova, and those who came on the Agudat Shalom trip a couple of years ago may remember that name and that place. Josef and Victoria Ulma were two religious Catholics. They were farmers in a small village called Markova. And he was an amateur photographer. They had 6 small children. The oldest, I think, was 8 years old. And the Ulmas, like other residents of Markova, had witnessed in the summer of 1942 the massacre of Jews by the Nazis. And the Jews were buried in the animal burial ground. Some Jews managed to escape and went into hiding in the surrounding area. And some of them were hidden by people in Markova. A couple of months later, in the fall of 1942, when the hunt for Jews was at its height in the whole surrounding area, a Jewish family from a nearby city called Landshut, the Schall family, S-Z-A-L-L, came to Markova, knocked on the door of Josef and Victoria Ulma, and asked for shelter. They granted them shelter, and also 2 sisters, Golda and Leica Goldman. 2 more Jews were brought in. And they stayed with the Ulmas for 18 months. 18 months, and I want you to remember that in Poland, under Nazi occupation, giving aid to a Jew or sheltering a Jew was punishable by death. On the night of March 23rd, 24th, 1944, after a year and a half of being hidden, German police came to the house, to the farmhouse. A couple of years ago, we visited that farmhouse as part of our journey to Poland. They found the Jews in the Ulma farmhouse. The Germans murdered the Jews first. And then they murdered Josef Ulma, Victoria Ulma, and the 6 children. Victoria Ulma was pregnant at the time with her 7th child. But the story doesn't end there. The morning after the murder of the Jews that the Ulmas were hiding in the Ulma family, the morning after, there appeared in the fields around Markova 24 Jewish corpses. 24 Jewish corpses. Why all of a sudden do 24 Jewish corpses appear across the fields of Markova? And the answer is Those were Jews who were being hidden by Polish Catholics in the Markova area. And when they heard what happened to the Ulmas, they murdered the Jews they were hiding. Well, why didn't they let them go? One could ask. To let them go was to encounter the possibility that they'd be captured and under torture reveal who had hidden them. And that family who had hidden them would then suffer the fate of the Ulmas. But that's not the end of the story either. Because in addition to the 24 Jews who were murdered by their Polish protectors, quote unquote, there were other Jews who were still being held in the homes of Polish Catholics, risking their lives knowing what happened to the Ulmas. I've read the testimony of 2, but there were more of them. So others continued to shelter the Jews even after the Ulma family was murdered. So if we look at this particular episode, and the current government in Poland certainly would like us to look at this episode and to look at the fact that of the Chasidei Umot HaOlam recognized by Yad Vashem, the righteous among the nations, there are 27,000 total that have been recognized with very, very strict criteria. The largest number are from Poland, more than 7,000 of the 27,000. On the other hand, we can look at this monument in a village called Jedwabne. Jedwabne is in northeastern Poland, not far from Łomża. And in July of 1941, the Polish neighbors murdered, we estimate, about 340 Jewish men, women, and children. They're Jewish neighbors. If you want to read a difficult book, not a long one, but a difficult book to get through, Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, which came out about 25 years ago, told this story, and it was actually there was an explosion in the Polish media about this particular story, because what he maintains in the book and what the evidence seems to show is that they were not murdered by the Nazis. There was a Nazi military garrison, but they basically stayed out of it. It was a massacre perpetrated by the Polish neighbors against their Jews. This memorial happens to sit on the site of a barn where 300 of the Jews, we estimate, were packed in, and then the barn was set fire. According to Jan Gross, Professor Jan Gross, currently of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, formerly of NYU, Professor Jan Gross maintains that the majority of the male population of Jedwabne was involved in the massacre. I wish I could tell you that Jedwabne is the only case of its kind. But actually the POLIN Museum, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, actually maintains there were dozens of cases like this. True, to put things in proportion, the vast majority of Polish Jews were murdered by the Nazis. 3 million Polish Jews were murdered by the Nazis, the vast majority in death camps. In Lithuania, the majority were probably murdered. The majority of Jews were probably murdered by the locals, not so in Poland. But if there were dozens of cases, it also tells us something about Polish-Jewish relations during the war. So the big question is, what was predominant? What was the predominant attitude in Poland during the war towards the Jews? Was it one of persecution, collaboration, and even murder, like in Jedwabne? Or was it one of help and rescue, like the story of the Ulmas and the story of all of those righteous Gentiles recognized by Yad Vashem? So Professor Jan Grabowski, a professor of history, Polish history in Canada, He's Polish himself, as you could probably tell by the name. And Professor Barbara Engelkling, who's a professor of history in Poland and is actually teaching in Poland, were recently involved in a trial, you may have heard of it, where they were accused of defaming a former mayor of a Polish town. But I'd rather talk about, at this moment, Jan Grabowski's book called Hunt for the Jews. That was the German term that was used for the obsessive hunt for Jews, even after almost all of them had been killed. The hunt for the Jews in the forest, where the Germans would actually send soldiers and police into the forest to find a single Jew that they had heard was hiding in a forest. This is part of the obsession of the final solution. It wasn't enough to kill most of the Jews. They had to kill every single Jewish man, woman, child they could get their hands on, and they would expend resources to do so. Well, they also enlisted Polish police, Polish firemen, and ordinary Polish civilians in these Jew hunts. And Jan Grabowski did a study of an area called Dąbrowa Tarnowska. It's an area near Tarnów, not so far from Krakow, where the majority of Jews in hiding perished as a consequence of betrayal by their Polish neighbors, or as a consequence of those Jew hunts that often included not only Germans, but Poles as well. He was drawing on Polish sources, Jewish sources, and German sources during and after the war. And his documentation is an indictment of the local Polish population in detecting and murdering those Jews who had been in hiding from the deportations. So while it's clear that the vast majority of Polish Jews are murdered by the Germans in the death camps, Grabowski estimates that about, and that number was about 3 million, he estimates about 250,000 Polish Jews were in hiding in the forests or using false papers. And with the threat of death announced by the Germans for anyone helping a Jew, and on the other hand, incentives if you would collaborate and turn in a Jew of money, sugar, alcohol, meat, many Poles handed over those Jews to the Germans. Grabowski estimates that only about 50,000 of the 250,000 in hiding survived. And he blames local Poles in rural areas for the small percentage of survivors. Of course, he also acknowledges the 20% who did survived only because Poles were willing to risk their lives and the lives of their families to save those Jews. Perhaps I can further complicate the situation by sharing the story of Irena Sendler. Irena Sendler participated with dozens of others in the smuggling of Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, providing them with false identity documents and shelter with Polish families and in convents. She was an employee of the Social Welfare Department of Warsaw, and as such, she had access to the Warsaw Ghetto because she was going in to check the sanitary conditions to make sure typhus didn't spread beyond the ghetto. And under the pretext of these sanitary inspections, she brought medications and clothing and food and medications into the ghetto. Sendler and other social workers that worked with her eventually were able to save hundreds of Jewish babies in this way. The work was done at tremendous risk, and it was done under the auspices of an organization called Zegota, Z-E-G-O-T-A, the Council to Aid Jews, a Polish Catholic organization that was founded in late 1942 in order to help Jews in hiding, in order to be able to provide funds for those who were sheltering them. The German occupiers actually suspected Irena Sendler. They actually arrested her. They condemned her to death. And it was only because Żegota bribed the guards that she narrowly escaped execution. And here, and I apologize that this didn't come out so clear, this is actually a document from Żegota, from one of the founders of Żegota in Warsaw. And it's a little bit cut off. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but at the very top, which you can't see, she starts out by saying, several 100,000 condemned people wait for death in the Warsaw Ghetto, behind the wall which cuts them off from the world. And now you can read that with me. They cannot hope for rescue. Help is not coming from anywhere. Henchmen roam the streets, shooting everyone who dares to leave his home. They also fire at everyone standing in the windows. Unburied bodies lie about on the streets. And if I'm skipping down now a few paragraphs, I don't think you can see it. For the past 6 months, the events in the Warsaw Ghetto have been repeating themselves in 100 Polish towns, large and small. The total number of Jews killed has already surpassed 1 million, and the number grows with every passing day. And then she writes, the world beholds this crime, more terrifying than any in the past, and utters not a word. So far, so good. So we think this Żegota organization is filled with people who are looking to help Jews, and it was. But it's more complicated than that. Take a look at that paragraph on the right-hand side that begins with the word we. We Catholic Poles do speak out. Our feelings towards Jews have not changed. We still consider them as political, economic, and innate enemies of Poland. What? She's talking about saving Jews, and yet at the same time, she's saying they are enemies of Poland. Well, this is actually part of a very complicated story about anti-Semitism. I learned, one of the things that I learned from Daniel Goldhagen, professor of political science at Harvard, in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. I learned from him something I had never thought about before. There's a spectrum of anti-Semitism. We as Jews often lump them all together, but they're actually quite different. There are people who don't want to live in a Jewish neighborhood. They'd rather not live in Borough Park. They'd rather not live in Flatbush or Forest Hills in Queens, if it's still as Jewish as it once was. They'd rather not. They would never lift a hand against a Jew. They would never support legislation against the Jews, but they don't like Jews, or they don't want to live in a Jewish neighborhood. Then you have people who don't like Jews. Well, they would never physically harm a Jew, but they think Jews have too much power. But then you have people who would say, we should do something to limit Jewish power. Oh no, I don't want to kill them. By all means. The Nazis are at the end of the spectrum. He calls it eliminationalist anti-Semitism. What this woman, whose name was Sofia Kossak-Szczeszuka, I hope I didn't pronounce that wrong. This woman reflects traditional Christian anti-Semitism, traditional Catholic anti-Semitism, which was not to murder the Jews. Yes, it was to keep the Jews as second-class citizens. Yes, it was not necessarily friendly to the Jews, but murdering every Jewish man, woman, and child, that was Nazi anti-Semitism, not traditional Christian or Catholic anti-Semitism. I once heard a survivor describe that as a child in the Warsaw Ghetto, he would sneak beyond the wall to try to get a loaf of bread for his family. And he went back to his old home, his old apartment building, and he knocked on the door of a family that they considered to be anti-Semitic. And they opened the door, they saw his condition, they gave him a loaf of bread, which, by the way, was punishable by the Nazis with death. But they gave him a loaf of bread because maybe they were anti-Semites. But that didn't mean they wanted to see all Jews dead, because there's a spectrum of anti-Semitism. Treblinka, the site of a death camp where more Jews were murdered than any other place in the world except for Auschwitz. In fact, more civilians. Outside of battlefields, there's no place on earth where in such a small space, in about a year, about 800,000 people were murdered. Well, there was a revolt in Treblinka. And in that revolt that took place in the summer of 1943, about 200 Jewish prisoners escaped. About 100 of them survived the war. The other 100 who didn't survive, many of them were murdered by local Polish peasants or informed upon to the Germans by local Polish peasants. The 100 who survived, almost all of them survived because they were helped by Polish peasants. Both of those stories are true. When the war was over, there's a tiny surviving remnant of Jews. Only 10% of Polish Jews had survived the war. From 3.3 million, only 300,000 survived. I guess it's better to say 1 out of 10 survived. Maybe that makes it a little more real. 9 out of 10 Polish Jews were murdered. And by the way, of the 1 out of 10 who survived, the vast majority survived because they fled to the Soviet Union and they didn't spend 6 years under Nazi occupation. That was the story of my parents and most of my uncles and aunts. The ones they left behind, one aunt and my 4 grandparents, Aleichem Shalom, were murdered by the Nazis. Jan Gross wrote a book, the same one who wrote the book Neighbors about the Jedwabne massacre. He wrote a book called Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz. And very early in the book, he tells a story that is absolutely chilling. He tells a story about the day of liberation, when the Red Army comes and liberates a Polish town. And the Polish rescuer goes to the basement or the attic where he was hiding 2 Jews. And he knocks on the door and he opens it and he says, "The Red Army is here. You're liberated. You're free to go." Well, you can imagine the relief on their face. And he says to them, "Before you leave, let's drink a l'chaim." Well, maybe he didn't use the word l'chaim. Let's drink a toast. And of course, the 2 Jews who've been hidden by this righteous Pole raise their glasses to him and say, "Thank you. You saved our lives. We don't know how to repay you." And the Polish rescuer says to them, "You're very welcome. I have only one request of you. Please, don't tell anyone that I saved you." What? Don't tell anyone that I saved you? This man was a hero. The atmosphere in Poland at the end of the war was virulently anti-Semitic. According to Jan Gross in his book Fear, in the 18 months following the liberation of Poland, 1945 and 1946, about 1,000 Jews are murdered by their Polish neighbors. That's 1,000 people who survived the Nazis, murdered by their neighbors. Why? Well, first of all, there's the heightened anti-Semitism of the 1930s that we described, pogroms in 1937. That continues, maybe was intensified by German anti-Semitic propaganda. Secondly, we mentioned the Jews were identified with the communists. And in post-war Poland, there's a battle going on between the Polish nationalists and the communists who were backed by the Russians. And the Jews were somehow identified with the communists. It's true, there were some prominent communists who were Jews, but as Jan Gross writes, most Jews were not communists, and most communists were not Jews. But nonetheless, that was the image, Judeo-Kommuna, Jewish communists. Last, and I think certainly not least, after 6 years of Nazi occupation, many Poles had moved into many Jewish homes, had taken over many Jewish shops, many Jewish factories, had used the material, the property that Jews had left behind, whether they were linens or pots and pans or jewelry or whatever it was. And now, some of those Jews are returning. Well, driving them out of Poland or killing them means there's nobody to reclaim that property. So the wave of pogroms hits Poland with the liberation. Under communism in 1957 and 1968, part of the wave of pogroms, the most horrific massacre was of 42 Jews in the city of Kielce on July 4th, 1946. This is the building where Jews were living and were murdered by their Polish neighbors in what was essentially a blood libel. The child went missing. The Jews were accused of murdering the child. The child was found perfectly safe. But 42 Jews paid with their lives. The news of the Kielce pogrom shocked the survivors in Poland, and the vast majority of them fled to safety to the DP camps, the displaced persons camps. Ironically, these Polish survivors fled to Germany for safety. My parents among them. In 1957-1968, this is from the POLIN Museum in Warsaw, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And the person on the TV screen is Gomulka, who was the head of the Polish Communist Party. And he is giving a speech that launches a purge against the Jews of Poland, where they're purged from positions where there's a wave of anti-Semitism, both in 57 and in 68. And most of the surviving Jews leave Poland as a result. We often hear survivors say, the Poles, they were worse than the Germans. Actually, if you speak to survivors from Lithuania, they'll tell you the Lithuanians were worse than the Germans. And if you speak to survivors from Hungary, they'll often tell you the Hungarians worse than the Germans. Now, in some cases, like in Lithuania and Romania, where the locals, the Lithuanians and Romanians actually murdered the majority of the Jews. Statistically, they're right. But I think what we're talking about here is not statistics. I think what we're talking about here is a sense of betrayal. It's one thing for the foreigner, the occupying power, the Nazis to come in and murder Jews. That's terrible. But for neighbors, people we went to school with, people we did business with, that's an added layer of betrayal. And I think that's what leads to those statements, which in many cases were true and in many cases may not have been true. But that emotional betrayal, I think, is what's behind it more than anything else. If you remember the play Julius Caesar, you know, he's stabbed by a number of senators, but when he's stabbed by his supposed ally Brutus, he says, "Et tu, Brute," then falls Caesar. So what predominated? What predominated in Poland during the war, after the war, what predominates now. No doubt, Jan Grabowski's research shows that in Dąbrowa Tarnowska, and one can reasonably extrapolate to other rural areas of Poland, that most Poles were not willing to take the risks to save someone. Most of them were probably indifferent. Some of them were very eager to get money or alcohol or meat or some reward from the Germans for collaborating with them and turning Jews in or even murdering them. As I said on our journey to Poland, if I have to put myself in the position of, God forbid, someone needing shelter in my house and having to decide, will I hide that person if I know the risk is my life and the life of my wife and my children? Would I do it? I'm not sure I would. When I was younger, I always used to think, big deal, 27,000 righteous among the nations, 7,000 in Poland. Why weren't there more of them? But actually, when I look at it now with a more mature lens, I'm amazed there were so many. I don't know if I would have been among them. On the other hand, I'd like to hope that I wouldn't turn in my neighbor for a kilo of meat or for a bottle of alcohol or for a certain sum of money. After the fall of communism in 1989, there were liberal governments that supported Jewish life and were more open to looking at their own history during the war more objectively. There was, I would even say, a honeymoon period for the small Jewish community in Poland and for Polish-Jewish relations. Pope John Paul II, who was formerly Bishop of Krakow, was a leader in the fight against communism, but also declared anti-Semitism is a sin, quote unquote, and went further than any other pope to further improve Jewish-Catholic relations. And what I'm showing you here is a matzeva that was taken from the Jewish cemetery. There were hardly any matzevot left. It was desecrated by the Nazis. But this one was taken and put on the front of the church. Look to the right of the picture and you see the wooden doors of the church. It stands right in the front of the church of the little town of Kalushin. Little town of Kalushin. In 1990, the local priest puts the matzeva up, and above it, you can see he wrote on a piece of marble, he had inscribed, Kalushin 1939, Poles 3,000, Jews 6,600. This priest wanted to remind his congregants, once communism had fallen, that actually their town was once predominantly Jewish and that they shouldn't forget it. And that sentiment is one that runs across a whole swath of Polish society, particularly in the years after communism, and among some even today, particularly the urban intellectual elite. So that, for example, when I go to Kalushin, there is a local who takes me and my groups around and shows us all the Jewish sites. He's not Jewish. He knows much more Jewish history of his town than I do. The same thing in Tarnów, the same thing in Sądz, and the same thing in so many towns in Poland. There's a local Pole or group of Poles who are working to try to preserve Jewish memory in the town. In 1988, a year before the communism fell, there was a Jewish cultural festival opened in Krakow. It meets every year except last year because of the coronavirus in June. They're hoping to meet again this year. 25,000 people come. It's the largest Jewish festival in all of Europe. In fact, it's one of the largest festivals on the Polish festival calendar. And at the end, it ends on a Motzei Shabbat with a Havdalah ceremony by Rabbi Michael Shudrich, the chief rabbi of Poland. And there are 25,000 people who are packed into the Shiroka Street, which is the heart of Kazimierz, watching him make Havdalah on the stage. I was there once in June, and I started walking through the crowd, looking for a Jewish face. I hardly saw any. The Jewish Studies Department at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow is booming, with non-Jewish Poles who are studying Yiddish, Hebrew, Jewish history. Of course, this is not the whole story in Poland. The party that's been in power for the last decade or so, the Law and Justice Party, has trumpeted the rescuers and tried to whitewash everything else that happened during and after the war, all of the collaboration in the Shoah by Poles. And they've played to the anti-Semitic elements in Polish society today. Some of this is an urban-rural split. Maybe there are certain parallels in America as well. Lahavdil, elef alfei pamim, that the urban population tends to be much more liberal than the rural population, which tends to be much more conservative and nationalistic. And in Poland, again, remember, nationalism basically excluded the Jews because to be a real Pole, you had to be a Catholic. So that kind of honeymoon period after 1989, as opposed to the last decade where the Law and Justice Party is in power, is actually a microcosm of the ups and downs of Polish-Jewish relations. Remembering that Poland was a safe haven for Jews, much more so than other European countries from the Middle Ages until the early 20th century. And I wanted to end on perhaps a little bit of an optimistic note. When we went to Poland together, I believe we went to the JCC in Krakow. The JCC in Krakow is, you see the gate is open here. The gate is open all the time. They don't have guards at the JCC. They don't have guards in the shuls in Krakow. Unlike in America, unlike in Europe, you just walk into a shul. Nobody checks you. There are no metal detectors. Nobody asks you for your passport. Rabbi Avi Baumel, who was a rabbi from Israel who spends half his time in Krakow, wears a kippah in the streets, and has told me and told other groups that I've brought that he's been there now for 4 or 5 years. He's never had a bad word said to him, even though he wears a kippah on the street. Does it mean that all people in Krakow or all people in Poland love Jews? No. It does mean that the picture is much more nuanced than some of us would like to believe. It's not all black, it's not all white, certainly. The JCC has 75 non-Jewish volunteers who come and man the desk of the JCC every day. And Friday night, they serve a Shabbat dinner to the small Jewish community in Krakow. I've been there. All the waiters and waitresses are non-Jewish volunteers. They don't even get paid. Anti-Semitism has been the most persistent of hatreds across the Western world. It exists almost everywhere, sometimes rising, sometimes in decline. We need look no further than the United States in the recent past to see that. On the one hand, the Shoah, arguably the worst of anti-Semitism in history, was implemented in Poland, aided and abetted by large segments of the population. I think that is undeniable. On the other hand, then as well as now, there are certain elements in Polish society that risk their lives and the lives of their families to save Jews, and today are very supportive of Jewish life and researching things Jewish. I know this talk has not given a clear answer, has not given you a black or a white. That's because it's complicated. And the complication and the nuance, I hope, has deepened your understanding about Polish-Jewish relations. I hope one day you'll be able to join me and Rabbi Cohen on a future journey to Poland to learn not only more about Polish-Jewish relations on site, but more about the history and the communities of Jewish Poland that existed for almost a millennia. Thank you very much.
David, thank you so much for speaking. You have a few minutes for questions?
Yes, absolutely.
I have one, and then we can just chime in. But I know when we were there in Krakow a couple of summers ago, there was an issue revolving around the Yitzhak synagogue.
Yes.
Can you update us on what's going on and maybe fill people in as to what the issue was?
The Isaac Shul is open. Just to recap a little bit, there was an internal Jewish community dispute between some of the people who control the Jewish property, like the shuls in Krakow, which is a very big cash cow, and between Chabad and the younger members of the community, and who were using the Isaac Shul for services. The people who control the property wanted to raise their rent astronomically. The younger members of the community and Chabad felt they could not pay that much. So the shul was closed for a period of time, but it's now open and being used.
Good to know. Okay.
It's the wars of the Jews.
Yeah. Gotcha. By the way, anyone that goes with David will know that the word "it's complicated," the phrase, is used quite often because it's complicated.
Yes.
I have one question to the topic. Actually, I was somewhat surprised that amongst American Jewry, Poland somehow separated from all other countries, like much more blamed, and there is position that shouldn't any money spent there. Yes, it complicated, and Poland wasn't definitely the best at that for sure. But why Poland only? All European countries were pretty bad, and I read some papers that, for example, France or Netherlands were even worse, considering that they have their own government and there was much more flexibility there. And Poland didn't have any government. And moreover, Jews from Germany looks like have better feeling towards Germany than towards Poland.
Yes.
And if we speak about betrayal, I think they should feel the same, even more in Germany, because in Germany, Jews were more integrated in society, while in Poland it was more lived mostly separately in many places.
Yes. I hear what you're saying. I think there's truth to it. I think that a lot of it has to do with the pogroms in Poland after the war, which I think had a tremendous psychological impact on the survivors and on people, Jews outside of Poland as well. I think also in the case of Germany, obviously Germany was responsible for the murder of most of the 6 million Jews, more than any other country. And yet Germany has tried, perhaps not enough sometimes, but they certainly have tried in many ways to come to grips with their own history. Many European countries like Poland have done less to come to grips with their history. So I think that that may be part of the reason why Germany gets off the hook a little bit more than Poland.
Professor, I highly recommend the Jan Gross book. I think it's superb history and very disturbing as well. But what I want to ask you is, what happened in '68? How few Jews there were and continue to be in Poland? And yet there seems to be something that's, pardon the expression, that's built into this Polish DNA that continues to be a virulent anti-Semitism borne out, as I think you pointed out, by a nationalistic view. But also, let's not let the Catholic Church off the hook, because the Catholic Church, and I'm not trying to be denigrating towards Catholics, but very prominent cardinals, in fact, a more senior cardinal than John Paul II, virulent anti-Semites. And I forgot where that cardinal was, whether he was in Warsaw or also a fellow cardinal in Krakow. But how few Jews are left, and yet they use this trope continuously against the Jews. It's very disturbing, and I'll end my comment there.
Yes, it's absolutely true. You know, someone wrote a book, I'm forgetting his name, Zvi Gittelman, wrote a book, I think it was in the 1960s, maybe it was in the wake of the '68 purge, and it was called Anti-Semitism Without Jews. Because it's true, the percentage of Jews in Poland, I mean, it was 10% before the war, which is an enormous percentage, more than any other country, maybe in the history of the diaspora. And yet today, there are really only a few thousand Jews. In 1968, there were only a few thousand Jews living in Poland. To ascribe to them all of the troubles of Poland was clearly exaggerated, but as you say, it resonated with the population. The former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said that Poles imbibe anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, there is some truth to that. On the other hand, I hope that you saw that from this talk, that that's true, and yet there are other truths too that go alongside of it.
I understand that.
Marvin Shokrat, I think, had some question.
Thank you. I want to just tell a brief story. When I went in 2010 to the Majdanek camp. So it was August, and we were about an hour and a half away for about a week. And we were waiting to see if they would reopen the camp because lightning had struck one of the buildings where shoes were kept. And it had burnt down. And they opened the camp in time for us to go. And I had a guide that they assigned to us, a non-Jewish guide. We walked around. I was there with my wife and 3 kids. The oldest was 15. The youngest was 9. And I said to him, so what actually happened? Why is this camp closed for so long? He said, well, first they thought it was lightning, but the weather report showed it was a clear night. So then they said it was the heat created a spontaneous fire in the building. So we walked around and we came to the exact spot where we could see the burnt out building, and I took some pictures of it. And I noticed that the bottom 2 barbed wires, you know, that encompassed the whole camp had been cut. And there was a second layer of barbed wire behind that, maybe 10 feet, and that had been cut only on the bottom. And coincidentally, right next to that, maybe 10 feet away, was a gate that a fire truck could actually go through, but it had a lock on it. So I asked the guy, what's going on here? He said, well, I guess the firemen tried to get under the wire. I said, that's ridiculous. Why wouldn't they just break down the lock and cut the wires? He's a fireman. He says, I don't really know. So we went back to Warsaw. I was particularly bugged by this the whole way back. So I called the commander of the base of the camp to get a better explanation. And his secretary said, oh, he's out of town and he can't get back to you today. It was my last day the next morning when I called. And I said, oh, where is he? Oh, he's all the way in Warsaw. I said, well, I'm in Warsaw. I called then, I had met with the Jewish genealogy people in Warsaw. And she was meeting with the commander that very time that I called. And I told her my story and she said, well, you know, we have an agenda we have to stick to. I can't get detoured, something like that. I don't really remember the details. And I spoke to the rabbi that I had seen over Shabbos at the main synagogue in Warsaw. And he also was no help. Basically, the theme that I heard from the Jewish leaders was that we have bigger problems than cutting some barbed wire and putting fire on a pretty large building, which had, I don't know how many shoes. So I came back to the US and I contacted the Simon Wiesenthal organization, which I had been somewhat involved with, more or less as a donor. But I also happened to be, through marriage, related to Marvin Heyer. So they also were not interested in this story. And, you know, the biggest takeaway from that I got was they have bigger problems right now, meaning in 2010, with, I don't know whether it was Treblinka or some other camp where they were in the process of fighting back an attempt to clean it up or clear it out or whatever. So I'm just sharing that story because it was so upsetting. And I wanted to contact the chief of the fire department to get his side of the story. You couldn't get anywhere. Just couldn't get anywhere. Finally, I just gave up after, you know, a few months of trying to, after I got back to the States, trying to do something. Thank you for listening.
We just mentioned that the majority of prisoners in Majdanek were Polish. It's a place of Polish martyrdom, not just Jewish martyrdom. It's true that most of those who were killed there were Jews, most of the victims, but most of the prisoners are actually Polish. Poles view Majdanek as they view Auschwitz as places of Polish suffering and martyrdom, again, feeding into their view of themselves as victims. And they were victims. The Nazis murdered anywhere from 1 to 3 million Polish Catholics, along with the 3 million Polish Jews. And Majdanek is one of those places where it happened.
One other person had a comment and then we'll wrap it up. Bruce,
Sure.
Bruce, go ahead.
My mother's family came from a city called Novokorsun, and a Finnish director in Finland did a 1 hour and 15-minute film about two Polish families who had saved Jews in that town. And interesting, one of them had actually he had hid Jews in a bunker underneath his kitchen. And he had actually saved my uncle because he was there for the last 5 weeks of the war until they were liberated by the Russians. But interestingly, he said he could not tell his small children, he could not tell his friends, He could not tell his parents. He had to send out his Ukrainian maid because these people came, there's about 7 people. They used to come out once a day to go to the bathroom. He was so fearful of everyone that they would end up being killed because of this. And even after the war, he did not want any of them to even tell anybody that he had done this. And my uncle, who used to send him money and thanks and did other things for him, used to use a Polish name because he could not have any idea that some Jew was helping him.
Yeah.
Interestingly, one of the families, by the second family that was saved, you know, in their opinion, they said, yes, some Poles saved Jews, but 95% of the Poles were against Jews. I don't think that was an exaggeration. I think that's probably a true fact.
I think that's Jan. Thank you for that, Bruce. I think Jan Grabowski's book documents that. I don't know if the figure is 95%, but certainly that it was the social norm at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, for sharing. What's the name of the movie? Do you know offhand, Bruce, or no?
I have to go back and look.
Okay. You can let me know and I'll share with the community.
This family from Poland was honored by the Archdiocese of New York in the late 70s.
Thanks.
I
Dave-
had just one comment or question. The basic question is what the attitude is, the level of anti-Semitism now in the next generation. I mean, I can relay you kind of a story also. You know, I went with my mother and father back to their towns in Poland in the 90s. And we got to my father's town and we went with a private guide. We were taken to we wanted to see the cemetery of the town. And that was a mile or 2 outside of the town. We got to the cemetery. We were walking around and trying to make out some of the names. And we were chased by young hoodlums yelling, "Jid, Jid, Jid." And we had sort of a similar encounter in one of the towns where we went into a store and again noted Jid, Jid, Jid. So what is the attitude of the current generation towards Jews?
Right. It's a very good question. And, you know, I think that it breaks down my impression. You know, it's very hard. I don't have a poll that shows, you know, attitudes towards Jews by people under the age of 30 or something like that. So this is not statistical, this is anecdotal, is that it breaks down more along urban and rural. And that if you met with university students in Warsaw or in Krakow, I think you'd find generally, not always, a different attitude. And I think that in some of the small towns, you'd find a smaller minority that would be favorably disposed to Jews. And the numbers who are outright anti-Semites would be much higher. That's my impression from my trips to Poland. Anti-Semitism exists in Poland and everywhere. It's a question of to what extent does it exist. It's been particularly virulent in Poland in particular time periods. And I think that one of the things that Jan Grabowski's book made an impression on me was that those people who rescued Jews in Dąbrowa Tarnowska were not only risking their lives with the Germans, but were actually going against the social ethic, social norm at the time, which just, to me, makes them seem even greater. But there's no doubt that there is a good deal of anti-Semitism. There was, and there still is, a good deal of anti-Semitism, and that allows, for example, for the Law and Justice Party to remain in power. That's not the only reason people vote for them, but it doesn't prevent a lot of people from voting for them as well.
Thank you. Diane had one last question. Go ahead, Diane.
Two questions. Were the majority of the people that saved Jews, were they religious Christians or secular? That's one. And the second one is we hear about the Uyghur Muslims who are in concentration camps in China. I'm wondering what you think we should all be doing to help that situation.
Yes. I'll answer the first question. I'm not sure I can answer the second question. It's interesting, the research that's done about the rescuers, not only in Poland, but elsewhere too, shows that they actually ran across all socioeconomic and every other kind of line, religious. So you have priests and nuns who are saving Jews, and you have also atheists who are saving Jews, communists. You have men and women, you have illiterate peasants, and you have university professors. It really, those things don't seem to make too much of a difference. I know that in our mind, we usually think, oh, the illiterate peasants, they're the anti-Semites, the educated people are not. That actually isn't true, not only about the rescuers, but anything I've seen about anti-Semitism, even in America today, shows that it's not necessarily always along those lines. Look, the fact that we are so helpless in the face of human suffering today, in many parts of the world, and even in the countries in which we live, to me is a little bit of a correction, a little bit of a I guess the word is a correction, from my naive younger years, when I would say, why didn't the world scream out? Why didn't anybody do anything? And I don't mean to say that every suffering in the world is comparable to the Shoah, because most of them are not. But we see that there is something about human nature. There's something about power dynamics in the world that prevents people from doing something, especially when people are far away, but sometimes even when people are very close. So, you know, I would guess that if, you know, you write to your Congress people, you know, maybe they'll take a stronger stand against China. Maybe they'll insist. Remember what we did in the Soviet Jewry movement that we were talking about? All of those letters to congressmen got the Soviets to start releasing Jews because they wanted a free trade agreement with the United States. Maybe that's possible. But one of the things that I emerged from my study of the Shoah is actually more pessimistic. I hate to say it, but more pessimistic about the ability to galvanize people to the cause of human suffering.
Thank you for that sobering view, but as you say, it's complicated. There are many cases where even individuals have made a difference, and you know, we should obviously keep in mind, as we learned,
It's true.
that there is suffering. At least lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, we can't finish it, but we still have to do whatever we can. So the lecture, I think I speak on behalf of everybody, the presentation was superb as always. He gave us a lot to think about. And we look forward, God willing, to continuing to learn from you in the months ahead. And hopefully, I'm sure you'll have us in mind. It should be a meaningful Yom HaZikaron this week in memory of all those who gave their lives for Israel, but also beautiful, God willing, a Yom HaAtzmaut. So Shavua Tov, and we should share, God willing, good news in the days ahead. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah.